The ancients have been a constant source of inspiration for European man. His art and architecture, science and philosophy, law and language trace their origins to Greco-Roman civilization. Each generation has attempted to emulate the grandeur of this civilization. Shakespeare attempted to emulate Aeschylus, just as the Renaissance masters attempted to emulate the sculptors of antiquity. Washington attempted to emulate Cato, just as Napoleon attempted to emulate Caesar. Each successive generation of European man has sat at the feet of the Greeks and Romans. Each has believed that they had something to learn from the ancients. For this reason, education in Europe has revolved around the study of antiquity. Every educated European was expected to know Greek and Latin in order to read the classical writings. Europeans, whether in America or Austria, viewed these classical writings as excellent sources of political and philosophical wisdom. To quote a letter written by Thomas Jefferson, "To read the Greek and Latin authors and their original is a sublime luxury. I thank on my knees him who directed my early education for having put into my possession this rich source of delight." Today, very few people possess this rich source of delight. The ancient world has become a niche subject studied by a small circle of academics. We no longer turn to the ancients when tackling big questions. Instead, we turn to the social sciences, to psychology, to economics, to sociology. As a result, most educated people know nothing about the ancient world. They have, therefore, failed to learn some very important lessons. One of the important lessons that they have failed to learn from the ancients is that culture is downstream from agriculture. In order to appreciate this point, we must first discuss the agrarian origins of Roman civilization. Rome began as an agricultural society. The Roman farmer owned 2 or 3 acres, which he tilled with his own hands. He slept on straw, rose early, and lived off his own produce. Livy described the early Romans as follows. They cultivated their own fields, made their own clothes, and built their own houses. They were a self-sufficient people, and they prided themselves on their independence and their ability to take care of themselves. Livy's description of the early Romans applies not only to the lower classes, but also to the upper classes. Indeed, the patricians of this time were not lords of comfort and luxury, but farmers who often put their own hands to the plough, lived simply, and wore clothing spun in their own homes. The plebs admired them, even when they fought with them, and applied to almost everything appertaining to them the term classicus, classical, i.e. of the highest rank or class. As far back as we can reach into Rome's past, we find private property. The farmer of the early Roman Republic was not a peasant, serf, slave, or tenant, but a yeoman, which is to say, a man holding and cultivating a small landed estate. They owned their own land and tilled their own soil, but they also voted in the assembly and fought in Rome's wars. They were, in other words, the backbone of the Roman state. To quote Victor Davis Hanson's book, Fields Without Dreams, the Roman Republic was built on the backs of its small farmers, who were the soldiers, the citizens, and the heroes of Roman society. This small agrarian state ended up conquering Italy, Carthage, Spain, Greece, and Gaul. By 133 BC, they found themselves in command of a far-flung empire extending from Spain in the west to Asia Minor in the east. They were forced to administer this far-flung empire with the government structure of a city-state. Rapid imperial expansion during the Middle Republic strained nearly every aspect of Roman society, but none more so than the very foundation of Rome, the small farmer. The 3 main sources of strain came from the influx of slave-grown grain, the growth of large farms, and the influx of slave labour. Imperial growth brought new territories into the Roman orbit. These territories were particularly efficient at producing grain. Merchants began shipping grain from Spain, North Africa, and Sicily into Rome. This put downward pressure on the price of grain and created a source of hardship for small farmers. With their limited production volumes and higher per unit costs, independent farmers could not cover their expenses at the market price and were forced out of business. These developments led to a sharp reduction in the Roman middle class and a radical shift from a traditional subsistence economy to a market-oriented one. Many of the Roman farmers who traded plowshares for swords died in foreign lands. Those that did return home from war often found their holdings irreparably damaged by armies and neglect. Others were broken by accumulated debt. These men sold their lands at depression prices to aristocrats or agricultural capitalists who merged the little homesteads into latifundia, literally broad farms. Seneca described cattle ranches larger than kingdoms. These large farms were manned with war-captured slaves under a manager who was often himself a slave. The owners of these large farms rode in now and then to look at their property. They no longer put their hands to the work, but lived as absentee landlords in their suburban villas or in Rome. On the latifundia, slaves were preferred because they were cheap and not subject to military service. All the Mediterranean region was raided to acquire slaves for these industrialized farms. Every week, slave dealers brought people from Africa, Spain, Gaul, Germany, the Danube, Russia, Asia, and Greece to the ports of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. It was not unusual for 10,000 slaves to be auctioned off at Delos in a single day. These slaves toiled on the commercial farms from sunrise to sunset. They became responsible for almost all of Rome's agricultural production. The Roman historian, Pliny the Elder, said, "The small farms are being swallowed up by the larger, so that in the end we shall be left with a few men who own everything, and a mass of people who own nothing at all." Similarly, Columella wrote, "We have abandoned the husbanding of our soil to our lowest slaves, and they treat it like barbarians." A similar phenomenon could be observed in the cities. Nearly all domestic work, handicrafts, trade, banking, factory work, and labour on public works was performed by slaves, reducing the wages of free workers to a point where it was almost as profitable to be idle as it was to toil. Imperial growth struck at the heart of Rome's strength in ways that its conquered enemies never could. Rapid imperial expansion during the Middle Republic led to the influx of slave-grown grain, the growth of large farms, and the influx of slave labour. These things, in turn, led to the proletarianization of the Roman farmer. Men who had once owned and tilled land in the countryside joined the turbulent proletariat of the city. They watched without cost the exciting games of the amphitheatre, received corn and bread from the government, and lost themselves in the impoverished and indiscriminate mass. The countryside was depopulated and the Roman people were deracinated. A community of free farmers became landless, purposeless, and unemployed. To quote Hansen once again, "As the small farmers disappeared, the power of the wealthy landowners and the urban elites grew, until the Republic was no longer a society of farmers, but of plutocrats and oligarchs." The decline of the small farmer was the death knell of the Roman Republic, for it signalled the end of the agrarian ideal that had sustained it for centuries. The proletarianization of the Roman farmer laid the groundwork for the rise of authoritarian rule. Both Sallust and Tacitus recognized the link between the demise of the small Roman farmer and the rise of Caesar. Sallust wrote, "The common people, having been dispossessed of their lands, inflamed with a desire for revolution, and having nothing to lose, supported anyone who promised to help them." Tacitus similarly noted, "It was the impoverishment of Italy and the growth of the urban population which ruined the farmers and allowed for the rise of despotic rule." At the beginning of this video essay, I mentioned Jefferson's love of the ancient writers. He particularly loved the Roman historians, many of whom have been quoted during this video. From Livy, Tacitus, and Sallust, he learned about the link between self-government, virtue, and agriculture. He believed that small-scale property ownership conferred special dignity and autonomy to the individual. It gave them a stake in society that serfs, tenants, slaves, and urban proletarians lacked. This stake in society promoted patriotic virtues among the yeomen. The yeoman also exhibited virtues that are too often lacking in the idle rich and the idle poor. He had to be sober, strong, thrifty, and committed to work. For these reasons, and many more, Jefferson considered the farmer an ideal citizen. To quote him, "Cultivators of the earth are the most valuable citizens. They are the most vigorous, the most independent, the most virtuous, and they are tied to their country and wedded to its liberty and interests by the most lasting bonds." Jefferson believed that the small farmer was the backbone of the American Republic, just as he had been the backbone of the Roman Republic. The abolition of the small American farmer would, therefore, result in the abolition of the American Republic, as had happened in Rome. To quote a letter he wrote to Madison, "I think our governments will remain virtuous for many centuries, as long as they are chiefly agricultural, and this will be as long as there shall be vacant lands in any part of America. When they get piled upon one another in large cities, as in Europe, they will become corrupt, as in Europe." Today, we find ourselves in an all-too-Roman-like situation, but only far worse. The small, local farmer has been destroyed. A global food system powered by chemicals, powerful machines, and third-world labour has emerged to take its place. This global food system mass produces seemingly cheap food, but there is nothing cheap about it. The true costs are simply externalized. Our air is polluted, our water is poisoned, our cities are riddled with crime and pathology, our farms are indistinguishable from concentration camps, and our people are increasingly idle, obese, and infertile. You don't need to be a Marxist to recognize that work conditions all of man's other activities. Changing processes of production result in cultural transformations that affect every aspect of man's life. The shift in Roman agricultural production from many small producers to a smaller number of larger ones permanently changed the politics and character of Rome. It led to the degeneration of the Roman people and the rise of Caesar. Likewise, the demise of the yeomanry in the West has resulted in the complete transformation of our culture. A once proud and independent people, defined by their thrift, independence, sobriety, and patriotism, have been reduced to an indiscriminate mass who are almost totally dependent on the government and large corporations. The notion of self-government is totally alien to such people. That is why they consistently vote for greater levels of government intervention in their lives. That is why the government is the largest employer in almost every Western country. That is why government expenditure as a percentage of GDP continues to rise. That is why taxation and government debt have risen to breathtaking heights. That is why people ask the government for protection from unemployment, from global warming, from hateful speech, from the unvaccinated, from disease, disaster, ignorance, prejudice, racism, sexism, homophobia, and countless other public enemies and dangers. In other words, a people incapable of governing themselves will naturally seek to empower the state. In Rome, this led to the rise of the Roman dictator, Caesar. In our time, it has led to greater levels of government intervention. In the future, it will likely lead to an authoritarian restructuring of the West. Thanks for watching.